Welcome back to Deep Thoughts. Today's weather's kind of weird out there, so it's been raining off and on, so I thought I'd just set things up here in the garage and have a good time. Today, as you can tell, we're going to talk about the International Space Station that is primarily sponsored by NASA, supposedly put together by JPL, and is a source of amazing pride for Americans. Let me tell you, for those who are almost entirely asleep. Here's the thing. I really don't personally pay attention to this shit at all, the ISS. However, at my smoke lounge, it is something that they obsess on. And so I get to see, at any one day I go to my smoke lounge, probably 15 to 45 minutes of ISS videos done by Journalism and a bunch of other folks. Journalism is one of the best ones. And I don't endorse any one particular source because they have their good days and their bad days, just like I have on this show. And so, but at times, they do excellent jobs. And I'll say, the sources that I've seen that are the most powerful, that do compilations of a bunch of mistakes, a bunch of other things that we're going to get into on this episode, they're total nobodies, which really makes me feel like they're leaking from the inside, because they'll, I don't want to get too romantic with it, but they're, most of it is drawn from published footage, right, from the NASA.gov or whatever radio television station, that's being broadcast from space, whatever, supposedly, right? And it's like we can all feel bullshit. We can feel it. We 100% know that something is completely fucked with this thing, but we can't put our finger on it because there's so many different pieces and parts, and whoever's doing the particular ISS video of the day is usually myopically focusing on one thing. They want to make a video that's hour long or half an hour long, but they're talking about something that would take no more than 2 or 3 minutes to describe and leave it to you to decide. But because they try to fill up all the blank space, they speculate way outside of the range of possibility, and so you get lost. And the other thing they do is really strange and I notice this is like a massive trend on internet videos, and Alex Jones' team does it a lot, which is to repeat the same goddamn thing literally 5 to 10 times in a row. Same words, same sentence, slightly restructured, and no wonder everyone can make a 3-hour show. It's frustrating. I hope to God I don't do that to you on this show. But let's get into it. So the International Space Station is constructed out of a bunch of different modules over several years. It has teams of astronauts or cosmonauts from different parts of the world all seemingly getting together inside these capsules. There are a bunch of people that believe that they have seen it from the surface of Earth. And then we start doing the mathematics on what it would take to take a picture of one of these things and how long you'd actually have it in any one frame against a full moon. You start to realize it would be, out of a 30 frame per second shot, I think it's something like less than 3 frames would actually have the space station in it because it moves so goddamn fast across the sky. NASA has almost completely gotten used to, modeling something inside of a computer in 3D software, then creating a fake image of it in a computer and publishing it to science magazines and kids magazines and news organizations, and everyone reprints it as if there's some fucking satellite that's taken a photograph of every other satellite. There are armies of people on YouTube who are simply saying, JPL NASA, if you want to say that these things are real, then you need to produce images of your satellites that aren't that aren't created inside of a computer. Because we're paying for this shit, and we don't know what the fuck you're doing with our money. But the ISS has some serious issues, and it's, at some point it gets as bad as the moon missions. Another point, you're kind of going, wow, that actually looks pretty impressive and pretty believable. The strange thing is that we have this obvious disdain for NASA JPL. We do. They lie. They steal our money and they lie. It doesn't mean they don't make rockets. It doesn't mean they don't make satellites. It just means that what they are sending into space and spending our money on is not what they're telling the public. And so we are literally paying for what most likely is a nefarious project, something that is not for the greater good of mankind. They will pitch it to the compartmentalized, geeky nerds who can't think for themselves and tell them that it is for the greater good. Again, it's not terribly difficult to sway or compartmentalize a brain that doesn't think for itself. To be a nerd, you most often have to memorize and repeat things. The folks that could think for themselves typically go out and migrate out of their nerd phase, and they become pretty damn cool. And, they don't try to wear white shoes after November 1st, So the very fabric of these organizations can be very strange and weary and untrustworthy because they have gained an academic accolade by memorizing shit and repeating shit. And again, if what you're doing is not real, then who gives a shit if you know anything that is real? You're dealing in make-believe. Whether or not, you're in a compartment and you don't realize it and everything you hand in doesn't go anywhere, but you think it goes somewhere, so you go home and you get your big fat paycheck or whatever. It's important to think about this and remember this when we get into the integrity of these organizations so that you understand the very bowels of these organizations aren't built from people like Steve Jobs, who demand innovation, who demand proof, who demand purpose before they waste their entire lives on stuff. They don't like military-industrial complexes. They don't like anything that doesn't lead to peace. And they don't believe that war is ends to a means sort of thing. Before I get totally deep in this, it's important to realize that every year that passes by, that we don't engage diplomatic solutions head on with all of our enemies, all right? It does get to a point where their choice is war. Because everyone gets offended, everyone gets kind of bent out of shape when you can't diplomatically communicate and start to understand each other, right? Again, how many deaths in war? Let's do this little statistic in your head. You won't know the answer, but you'll know the answer. How many times has a soldier killed another soldier in war, or a person in war, when they could not have said their name to that individual in their native language? They knew nothing about their language, their culture, what they believe, and yet they murdered the other person because someone else behind them told them that that's what they were supposed to do. And that's how space organizations get created. That's how they get compartmentalized. All they want is the academic sense of purpose, because purpose is love and love is purpose, right? If you don't have purpose in life, you're a loveless being, and you must run out and find it. And I guarantee you, your choices are ample. So don't fret, don't worry. You will find a purpose nearly instantly upon deciding that you need to. But to tie it back to the ISS, the space program, as I've mentioned in several episodes, is something that man usurps as their own accomplishment. If you see a man step on the moon, then vicariously speaking, you feel like you stepped on the moon. You feel like your genetics are strong enough to have developed a rocket and all the propulsion systems, radiation shielding, all this good stuff, life support, to get someone up there, even if it wasn't you. So it feels good. to be remotely associated with these organizations, if you believe them to be real, you feel good about yourself. My God, I work for NASA. I have a cousin that used to build NASA's website. She felt amazing. When she asked me what I was doing with my life and I wanted to talk about this particular show, I just avoided talking about the NASA part of it. So the space station is up there, supposedly. Again, something might be up there that people are taking photographs of. It just may not be what we actually see on television. But most of the indications are that since every piece of footage inside this thing seems to be utterly fake, and most of the footage outside of it also seems fake. On one perspective, it seems convincing, and on another perspective, you have to ask those questions that we ask on this show that seemingly no one else asks, at least as clearly as we do, and in one clean shot. So just to quickly get out there, the things that we're gonna review that will be very interesting is that we have anomalies like this. Supposedly, there's a space station that orbits the moon, that orbits the Earth, every few hours, right? Because it's moving so fast. They've never, to my knowledge, taken one shot of the moon from inside or outside of the International Space Station. Meaning, take the camera and turn it around and point it at the moon. Come on, you're right there. It will be the most glorious shot we have seen of the moon with just a stationary handheld camera. But that never happens. We think that never happens because the same problem that they had on the moon set, the whole goddamn thing is inside of a gigantic warehouse. We have seen 1,000% certain astronauts trying to do a 360 spin forward or backwards inside of a room and getting hung up on their wires. We have seen the astronaut next to them reach over and grab the wire that's invisible, which then causes a tug on the clothing, a very specific thing that we do in Hollywood to make people levitate. We put a body harness around them to keep the entire torso under control, and then the actual contact points are about 10 degrees back from the left or right hip bone, going towards your ass on both sides. That's exactly where we see these harnesses. We see harnesses underneath clothing. Again, when you're in Hollywood, you know exactly what these things look like, and these astronauts are wearing them. And instead of NASA coming out and saying, "Oh, we put these things on to make sure people don't, float away in an interview or something," they don't say shit. So it remains a hoax. It remains a technique of a hoax. There's several of them, but there's one that's like 2 minutes and 50 seconds long on the internet of just these guys trying to do 360 spins and failing miserably. And failing with absolute 1G gravity here on Earth. We've seen blue screen after blue screen after blue screen of ISS footage, meaning these astronauts are composited into scenes where the background is part of a digital adaptation of a blue screen or green screen session, meaning they've got a blue screen behind them and we're digitally mapping this just like the weatherman on the news. How do we know this? Well, those of us with super trained eyes can see that the color palette between the two isn't the same. A lot of these astronauts have kind of bleached out contrast maps, and so they are very pale, and the blacks aren't black and the whites aren't white, but the background right behind them has those qualities because it is the last thing that's been added to the original image. There's too many studio lights on. A lot of times the color palettes don't match what's in the room, so the reflective ambient light off the astronaut is perhaps a green when everything in the back is blue. Those of us who are fairly decent in Photoshop, you can cut the astronaut out separately, color correct them, look at what it takes to color correct them, then color correct the back and see what it took to color correct that, and you will see the difference in spectrum of lights that are in the room. NASA has pissed off the special effects industry, these individuals, these kids that have, $1 million tools. We have all kinds of tools that can take static 2D images and determine how many lights were in the room, generally speaking, and from what direction were those lights actually casting. And so we use that software on old NASA footage, and we can find, 5 to 7 light sources on the moon. And we're talking about very acute studio lights, not just reflection off of a surface. That is all compensated for in the software. We have one of the best pieces of footage is a guy shooting himself down the barrel of the ISS. You see him do it all the time, right? And he grabs a handle to turn himself into the next tube. That's kind of a neat little maneuver he's figured out. But as he's turning the corner, the composite shot in whatever tool they're using accidentally faded his opacity to, I don't know, it goes from 100% opacity, which means you can't see through his body, to 0% opacity where he is completely transparent. So as he turns the corner, his body becomes transparent, and you can see the door jamb through his body because he is a layer inside of a composite piece of video software. Now, the only thing I'll put out there on that one is that that particular claim came in from a single source, and you could easily do that to a piece of footage in whatever composite software you have in your house, release it, and claim that it came from NASA. So that one could be suspect of creating a hoax, but the guy got probably a pretty penny in his bank account having created it if he didn't get it from NASA Live. We have the claim that I think is fairly well founded that some of the scenes are actually shot inside vomit rockets, which are jets that go way up in the high atmosphere and then dive down towards Earth at such a pace that people are weightless. And the reason why is that you have, and again, I'm not familiar with the full construction of every system inside of an ISS, but you have it where someone is having an interview. There's probably like 10 people. They pull all the astronauts together from the Russian side, the American side, and what have you. And they're passing around these little mics. And as they pass it closer to the edge of the ISS, it gets very, very loud and seems to sound almost identical to what it sounds like when you and I ride in a normal commercial jet aircraft. That sort of patented turbine crunching, air crunching sound, that thunderous white noise that you hear. And so if there were other mechanical devices in the ISS sustaining life support, moving things around, redigesting your urine or whatever, the idea that stuff would coincidentally sound identical to a turbine engine in the normal atmosphere is seemingly odds against, right? The hair on women. Zero-G gravity is a very special thing that, we only get every once in a while when we go to an amusement park, right? We go on a ride that goes up and down, and so we've done it. But in a micro sense, we've done it every time we've got on a swing, when we jump off a diving board. So we have these little tiny instances where we do understand zero gravity a little bit. Now, true zero gravity, as it is theorized, is the fact that is made possible by going up so high in the atmosphere and going so quickly that when you fall back down to Earth, you're going so fast that you end up falling around the outside of Earth, and Earth's gravitational pull keeps you falling around the Earth. That's how an orbit works on the text paper. And again, we'll put every other theory of how the world works aside for this episode. But the hair on the women in the NASA ISS videos is most definitely 1,000% hairsprayed up, like the old haircuts we had in the 80s for girls. How do we know this? Well, they move their head a lot. Violent movements of the head, the neck, turning around, and the hair never seems to lose its hairsprayed state. But for those of us who grew up in the 80s, we understand exactly how those haircuts work in 1G with hairspray in them. Now, there's a couple people out there, and again, just for the sake of this video, anyone getting butthurt about it, we won't mention names, but there's a brunette and there's a blonde. The brunette makes the most videos. If she were to move around, and she has this huge hair, and it's fucking laughable that someone could go around the International Space Station with their hair out anyway if they had long hair. As you can tell, your humble narrator has dealt with long hair for a while. I will tell you, if you're a dude and you don't hang out with a woman with long hair, it's everywhere. It gets everywhere all the time. Even if you don't have any hair loss issues, it just comes out and it regrows. It's just what happens. Your bathroom floor covers is covered with it. Your brushes are full of it. Your drain is full of it. It's in your laundry. It gets into little tiny hairballs. It's everywhere. Think about being on the International Space Station with some broad jumping around with her fucking hair out. Those goddamn hairs would be floating in space. You'd be trying to talk to someone and her hair would go into your mouth. Technically speaking, it would do the same thing for a dude, except it'd be nice and tiny. You'd be trying to breathe at night when you go to sleep, and you would breathe it up your nose. It'd be horrendous to be in zero-G with hair that's willy-nilly floating around. Now, if you were to be in space, a friend of mine made a really good point. When do you see any other NASA program where people don't wear a uniform? Right? You never see that. Everyone always has a uniform. Now, I know what some of you are going to say, well, these people up there for a really long time, they can't possibly wear a uniform. I mean, they couldn't possibly take their money, get all their fucking fame, and wear a uniform every day. That's asking too much. But it's not. What do you see up there? People are wearing their civilian clothes, seemingly picked out by themselves from the local Target or their fucking whatever. And these guys are wearing big, giant, furry sweaters. How many of you have had someone hug you with a brand new sweater? How many of you had a sweater come off on another piece of cloth? And it's just, you have to get those sticky little brushes to get all the shit off. There's no way in hell, in my opinion, that people could just wear civilian clothes willy-nilly as they like. Because what if someone picks the wrong kind of clothing and it gets really cold out there? The uniforms are designed to provide protection, both from the elements and from a temperature elements plus probably collision elements. In terms of your hair floating around, well, there's a reason why you have to put a hairnet on if you're going to work at a cafeteria or if you're going to be a shorter or a cook somewhere, because the shit falls out of your head. Kind of repeated myself there, didn't I? Overall construction of the ISS. Okay? Have you ever seen the inside of the ISS? It is a hoarded shit pile inside there. Unbelievably disorganized. And they seem to have, laptops all over these little kickstands everywhere, these little shelves. Wires all over the place on the outside of everything, everywhere. And again, we have our hair problem. Got to remember that. Getting stuck in all these things overnight. Remember, things of the same frequency like to attract to each other. And then they do, now keep that in your mind. Keep in mind that every single piece of equipment they seem to bring up there is just this hodgepodgey fucking thing. It's like they have this cylinder and they go down to Fry's Electronics, just buy any computer, any laptop, and just bring it up there. I guess it's integrated to the point a USB wire can actually integrate it with the ISS, right? It's because we're going to take a bunch of fucking risks with just cables that break, right? Nothing's integrated. Now, keep that picture in your brain. Now, let's think about all of the water experiments they do in that place. How many times have they taken their little, space packets and they put out a glob of water and then they drink it in the middle of the air and, they'll pop a bubble and it shoots out just like asteroids. The big meteorite turns into a bunch of meteorites and goes all over the place. Now, think about all that moisture bouncing around a cabin seemingly forever, because if you don't recapture that moisture, it's going to go bouncing around the capsule forever. I mean, it just will. I'm sure they have some dehumidification process going on at the same time, but if one goes right for that keyboard on that computer, the button's not going to work anymore. What if it goes into the port of a computer, starts shorting things out? Why would you dare play a game with the death of your entire system? You wouldn't. But if it's not real, you don't give a rat's ass. You're creating entertainment, something that, justifies, again, I'll say it a million times on this show, $60 million a day just to NASA. I think GPL has its own budget, which it has to be pretty close, right? The amount of problems we could solve in this country at $60 million a day would be phenomenal. Let's talk about spacewalks for just a split second. And then we will get into all the theories of how this stuff is actually pulled off. I'm not convinced exactly how this is pulled off, and I'll give you my impression of how I think it might be done. But we have spacewalks that don't have any purpose. We have, I just watched a video, 47-minute video, and there were 10 others I could watch. But there's a 47-minute video of a guy just sitting out in space. He isn't doing anything. He's just got his camera, and he's doing this weird shot. I mean, this really bizarre shot of this, one of the assembly arms that I guess grabs onto things. He's filming the little orifice that connects onto something really, really up close. It's a very detailed piece of hardware. It looks neat. And he's filming the Earth for most of it. But here's the telltale thing. One, there are no stars in space, right? Somehow they've muted the Milky Way, one of the brightest fucking things in space you could possibly film. All the stars out there that are brighter than the moon don't seem to show up in any of the shots, and the moon never seems to show up in any of the shots. So let's just call bullshit on those factors alone. The second big thing is that this guy is using a fisheye lens. He is filming the Earth and making it look ridiculously round. And yet people will look at these shots and say, see, I told you the Earth was round. Well, he's not far enough up there, dude, to really get much of a curvature. I mean, he is. He's going to get a little bit at, 250, I guess, on average. But again, take 250 miles. Take however many miles you think they're up and divide it by 8,000, and that's the percent off the surface of the planet. I did the math the other day based on Wikipedia. And essentially, they're 3% off the surface of the Earth. So, you can see some stuff. But the guy just sits out there to film a narrative, to give you the idea that they're really there, sitting there doing nothing. And consequently, being outside of the capsule should put you in the most dangerous possible scenario if a piece of debris hits you. Or maybe the capsule can fend it off, your suit can't. The other big question is, how is someone out there in space at 0 Kelvin, which is about 370 degrees below zero? Yes, the sun does hit you, but you're out there in your left arm is in a shadow at definitely 0 Kelvin, and your right arm is potentially in, the inverse temperature, and somehow your suit is capable of fending off all of the radiation that's going to make you puke your guts out, right? Again, if you travel on a plane from Los Angeles to Denver, scientists say that is a chest x-ray. And you're only supposed to get so many chest x-rays in your entire lifetime before you don't get to get any more. Okay? So, being in space, you're getting exposed to massive radiation no matter how you look at it. Official science, you're getting fucked up by radiation. You just are. But let's take warmth and cold and let's analyze it on an atomic level so you understand why it seems pretty far-fetched to some of us. What makes something cold? That is when an atom doesn't vibrate that much. What makes something hot? Well, that's when the atom is agitated and it vibrates a lot, right? When you put your hand in boiling water, you're putting in your hand into the molecules that make up the H2O, and it is super duper extra excited, which is why it boils and burns your hand. Fire is even more intense with an exponential curve of agitation. All right? Well, being in the sun in space, especially on the moon surface or something, you're probably just about 100 degrees. You're probably within about 50, 60 degrees of a fucking match. The average match temperature, I believe, is about 320 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're just within 50, 60 degrees of a goddamn match burning. So when you're sitting out there in space and you're wearing an outfit, right, there has to be insulation to knock down the kinetic transfer of either stability, which will make you super duper cold, where it's wanting to slow you down and you'll start freezing to death instantaneously, or agitating you so badly that you get boiled inside your outfit. When you look at these astronauts, and you look at these gloves especially, where you have to have the most attenuation in your body, right? You could put a big giant fur jacket on, and you're not fixing anything with your elbow joint. But your fingers have to be very agile. And so there's a lot of close-up photographs of these gloves. And when you start to do the geometry on the hand and the geometry on the glove, there does seem to be a fair amount of probably quarter-inch insulation to, say, 16th or 8th of an inch or so worth of padding. And they have these kind of weird padded fingertips and all that good stuff. But it seems that it's also made of material that will also take the form of its environment. So hard plastic, for instance, will get very cold. A hard plastic can also get very hot because its melting point is very high, but it can take that kinetic transfer and give it right to whatever's touching it. A lot of the trap doors, the supposed doors that protect you from the outside to the inside, even on the shuttle, for instance, are made of like canvas. And when they're pushed open on video, you'll see them bend and flop around. Now, I've tried to find, which is really funny, one night at my smoke lounge, I was sitting there and I said, well, maybe this is just some cosmetic door to keep dust out, where the heavier door, the real pressure cooker door, is on the inside. I was unable to find out any schematic about how these doors work. But the one that you see is definitely not capable of keeping out a brisk wind, let alone the vacuum of space. But people do tend to jump on every single anomaly, and it starts to make them look silly. Now let's get into the theories of how these shots are done, because it's going to reveal more accusations, which we can then go through in more context once we start talking about it. So there's two halves of the whole thing. There's interior and exterior. Now, I should footnote real quickly, in terms of people taking a picture of the ISS from Earth, everyone who seems to claim to have seen this and done this in Hollywood that I know, because they'll have parties on top of rooftops and stuff, the results that they claim are technically impossible and refuted by NASA and JPL themselves. So what I have discovered is that the nerds that say they've taken these images are full of shit. And so, if it was in geocentric orbit, it could sit in front of the moon for a couple days, then we've got the proof positive we have. But it does seem that there are independent astronomers and universities that seem to take a picture of a tubular station with big giant solar panels on it. So it would seem that something's up there. It just seems that they're working really, really hard to fake footage for us for some reason. Either it's up there and everybody died, and so they're just making sure that we don't know that, or something else is going on up there, or it's not what we think it is anyway. Well, let's go with interior shots. Well, we know that there are plenty of shots, without a question, that are done in front of blue screens because of major color balance problems and contrast balance problems. We also have the 360 spins with cables on their hips and harnesses under their shirts. That's definitely a guaranteed technique that they've used. We even saw a woman take a toy, and she was spinning it in her hands, and it's spinning forward until the wire, just like a rubber band, had reached as many rotations as it could entangle itself, and the thing started to spin backwards. And she grabbed it real quick and stopped it, and then looked off camera to some fucking director and said, "Oopsie," and it kept going. So there's that one too. So we know 1,000% that they're faking these things at some points along the way. But how do you simulate zero-G? Well, if you're in a harness, you can do it right here on planet Earth. The harness can actually lift your body up and down, and you can get your shirt all staticked up so it starts to stick to your body, Just rub a bunch of balloons on yourself before the interview. In terms of the women with the hair, they just spray paint their hair up in some silly configuration, which never ever moves like Medusa's snakes, which is what would happen if you're in zero gravity. But we do have access to these vomit rockets, right? This is where people are taught how to be in zero G. Zero G is very interesting in that you can have a fighter pilot with 10,000 hours of combat time pulling, enormous G's and doing crazy maneuvers and dogfighting and what have you. And they put them in zero G and they start puking their guts out. It's a very strange thing. The human body needs gravity to make its organs work properly. If you hung yourself upside down, your ability to digest food becomes greatly impaired. So there are theories about taking some of these shots, putting one of these modules inside a vomit rocket. The actors are up there pretending to be astronauts, and then they do these dives. They've already practiced the whole take. They've got their lines memorized and generally what they're supposed to say. And they're going to get about 60 seconds, to maybe a couple minutes of this falling to get all of the scenes worked out. And then they go back up again, come back down, and all they do is create a camera cut between the 60-minute segments. And someone did a great compilation where an astronaut went around and toured the entire space station, and it seemed to all be cut in these little segments, right? Now, what's interesting that I just learned yesterday is that, this Virgin Airlines is trying to do this space ticket for $250,000. We're going to be able to travel in space. Now, they've had 4 test flights. All 4 exploded. All 4 pilots were killed in this device. And now they're selling tickets to do it next year. You're a dumb motherfucker if you think you're going to be going up there when they haven't had one successful flight. Right? But they're selling tickets, supposedly. I can tell you, for the last 35 years of my life, again, like I've said in other episodes, we have sold all kinds of tickets to the moon and all this other shit, and it's never happened, okay? Every company that claims to be mining shit on the moon never ever gets off the ground. They just fucking say it to the public to get everyone strung out on this. Well, I heard they're doing that, right? Well, they're already doing that, right? I like chewing gum. But what's interesting is they talked about in this Virgin Atlantic pitch that you're going to get like 10 minutes of weightlessness. 10 minutes of weightlessness. And I thought, just with a high altitude aircraft, and I thought, interesting, if they can sell a 10-minute experience up there, then what could we do? And what have you been able to do for 30, 40 years? If you had a vomit rocket that's capable of giving zero G for 10 minutes, you could do all kinds of interviews and scenes. There are a lot of interviews with astronauts supposedly on the space station, and again, color correction-wise, it's pretty evident they're in front of a blue screen. In some cases, they seem to be on set of wherever these sets are, so it looks pretty good. They can interact with computers and things on the walls, so it's not a complete bust. But these kids will send up questions, and these astronauts will be answering them, and if you have even a thimble's worth of astrology, cosmology, any knowledge of the space programs, their answers seem almost inconceivably ignorant. Like they will pause on questions that you would learn in high school physics or high school astronomy. And they look at each other. They do the big thing, well, we need to lie about the answer here because we don't have the answer. And they do one of those things where they kind of look at each other and they kind of have this smirk on their face, right? Because the whole fucking thing is fake. And they're looking at you like, well, we just need to come up with an answer so the sheep down below believe, and hell, the only people really listening to this bullshit answer are children anyway. And you see it all the time. It's unbelievable. Now, I had recently said in another episode here that there's a scene where George Herbert Walker Bush, who's now wheelchair bound, was being pushed through, I believe, the Houston Center for NASA Mission Control, and he's being pushed through sort of a war room with the big screens up on the wall. And on the wall is a picture of an astronaut who's fairly famous for doing all kinds of science experiments for kids, and he's in front of a blue gridded blue screen, and the grid is used for spatial association for the astronauts. So, for instance, if you want to just blue screen someone into, the field like Oklahoma, or it's the weather, you don't care how far their torso is from the wall. You don't care. The reason why they put a grid on these things is to have spatial awareness for the software. So if they say, I know that the grid on the wall is, say, 4 inches by 4 inches. It's a 4-inch grid. Every box is 4 inches, okay? And I am seeing it at 3 inches in the camera. That means that I know how far away that is from the camera, plus the astronaut's body. As it fluctuates back and forth against this grid, I know how close he is from the grid to the front. And there's all kinds of pre-calibration you can choose to do if you want to. If you are sewing a human being into a spatial green screen or a spatial overlay, right, where the walls have to be a certain amount, like he can't be right next to a laptop, for instance, and he is way bigger or way smaller than the laptop, the mind's going to go, wait a minute, why does that laptop look like it's 8 feet wide? So these grids help us, increase the accuracy. But he's got a tennis ball he's messing with on this green screen, or this blue screen. And people have all painstakingly gone up and found all the experiments that he's claimed to have done on camera, and they have correlating composite versions of his seemingly what he's doing. Now, they don't have the exact scene composite, as to my knowledge, right? So they don't have, he lifts his finger for 1 second, and then we have it lifting his finger in another identical movie where it's all composited. So I don't believe we have the finished product that was on the wall. But it was an oversight because people were trying to push out a story of the former president visiting NASA. So in terms of internal shots, I think it's fairly safe to assume that they are doing 1G experiments using hairspray for the women and just using harnesses that aren't viewable, wires that are so thin that you can't see them. And just so that you know, in special effects for the last 20 years, we've had software that can pull wires out of negatives in a split second. And so it's very safe to assume that they've got real-time rotoscoping of wires, meaning masking, getting rid of them live. But these things might be so teeny you don't need to worry about it. The most convincing proof that they actually are in the ISS is one of the tours tends to move the camera down one of the tunnels and turns a corner and looks deep inside of another cavern. And when you think about all this trying to hide inside the fuselage of a jet, it's very difficult to assume that someone has a jet that massive, that you could have a 14-foot capsule perpendicular to another 20-foot capsule. Now, again, the only thing that would change that is that there's a stage where somehow this is all capable of hiding wiring and all that kind of stuff. But again, it gets pretty convoluted after a while. You can't put it past them if they're desperate. But that's one of the more convincing pieces. And again, if they're really there, they would film the moon. If they were really there, they could see stars for damn sure. And for those of you trying to hang on to the aperture argument that you're like, oh, well, they don't see stars because they got the aperture turned up to see the Earth and to block the sun from the Earth that's reflecting. Again, you got stars that are bright as hell out there, and the Milky Way is again, a super milky thing. And, hey, if you're up there for 1 goddamn hour filming the Earth, do me a favor, spaceman. Turn around, adjust the aperture, and film space for a goddamn second. It'd take you 2 seconds, all right? An iPhone could get a shot of the Milky Way in space, I assure you. Unless the new cosmologists that talk about an electrical universe say, they basically say you can't see stars from space because you have to have an atmosphere to have them bounce off of before you can see them. That's something that NASA has never admitted. But you have Eric Dollard and a bunch of cosmologists saying this constantly. And they're just independent guys that teach at universities. So I don't know why NASA doesn't come out and say that's it. But the problem is that you have astronauts who've written books, like, again, Michael Collins, who gets out of the Apollo 11 moon landing, comes home, he never touched the moon. But he says right after he did the mission, he never saw a star. And then he wrote a book about his experience and said he saw tons of stars. Oh, interesting. I guess you were really there, Michael. Now, to give Michael Collins some credit, we believe that Michael Collins was murdered up in Ohio where he lived because he had told supposedly his closest friends that at the 40th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, he was going to blow the whistle. And when Bart Sibrel approached him in his movie Astronauts Gone Wild, he didn't say a word to Bart Sibrel. And he pushed his nose into the camera and actually rubbed his nose, the grease from his nose on the lens. It was interesting, catching him at some supermarket. And again, if you went to the moon, there's no need for this behavior. But if you're trapped with your pension coming in only as a result of continuing the lie, and you got no other form of income, and you might be viewed as a traitor or whatever, if you tell the truth, you might understand why he did what he did. So we may owe Michael Collins a debt of gratitude in just, one, creating the anomaly that we would understand that there was a lie there, but two, attempting to tell the truth and being murdered in the process. External shots. This is where there's two camps of thought. Now, for those of you not familiar with the International Space Station training courses, here's how it goes. When you need to practice spacewalks and all this other stuff, you're actually in a gigantic pool of water. Now, when it comes to external shots, we have two camps that everyone seems to break into. So they put these astronauts inside these, spacesuits because they are supposed to be airtight and atmospheric tight. The interesting thing about water, as I've been told by plumber friends of mine, is that water can go where air can't, which I think is very interesting. So there's plenty of videos you can find online of them training underwater, and you have scuba gear diving people next to them with their tanks, and the astronauts rehearse these movements a lot, and it's actually really funny because when you watch and you really pay attention to these shots, they are treating this like a movie set in terms of how you would tell sound to roll and actors to get back in their positions and try it again and try it again. Obviously, rehearsing any type of movement out in space is very indicative of that sort of precision, right? But someone noticed that in some of the outside space footage, and especially by different countries, the Russians submitting footage and the Chinese submitting footage of being in orbit, you have this very standard kind of set design. Earth is on one wall, okay, and these space station props and stuff, or whatever capsule they're in, spaceship-wise, is in the foreground, obviously. And then you have your astronauts moving around, filming themselves in really technical-looking suits. People believe that they have seen air bubbles. Air bubbles that I have to say, I've watched some of the videos that claim to be air bubbles, and it is pretty damn phenomenal how you'll have some speck of dust, right? And again, I don't know how specks of dust get introduced in a vacuum of space, right? When they talk about space dust, they ain't talking about this kind of stuff. But you will see space dust move very interestingly. But we're going to get into the anomalies of water because I personally, if they use water, it's pretty much an old technique that they're not trying to use anymore. They seem to have cleaned it up quite a bit. But you'll see an air bubble that, I believe it's on a Chinese video, but I could be wrong. But there's an air bubble that gets stuck at the base of a visor, right? So the visor in front of the astronaut is very round. And this thing seems to go and hug the curve of really the tension of this actual surface, right? And water will do that because water is finding an adhesive quality to any surface, and especially in a vacuum, but especially in a pool. And it's also trying to go through the path of least resistance towards the surface as it is an air bubble. As things obstruct its straight vector up, it's going to follow the contour of that thing. And that's essentially what we see in these pieces of footage. And again, it's almost so evident that you can't really argue over it, to be honest. Now, there are dozens and dozens of videos where it looks just like an air bubble is kind of escaping in a particular direction. Again, this could be a piece of debris off something that they're taking outside. But what they're suggesting is that they're filming through water. Now, for any of you who know anything about water and light, you know that water creates something called refraction. Reflection is when you look in a mirror and the photons bounce back into your eyeball and you get to see yourself. Refraction is that weird thing when you put your hand inside a still body of water and it looks like your arm is on a different angle than your forearm that's actually holding on to the rest of your body. It bends light. Now, the notion is that if you could put a camera 100% submerged in 100% water, you're not going to see the normal light refraction versus the water refraction, and so whatever anomalies in the water is consistent throughout the entire water, so you don't get any problems there. I'm not I don't have a degree in water refraction science, but I would say this: if you're in a pool of water, water is going to take a much more chaotic, light is going to take a much more chaotic path through water on average over long distances than it would in just a pure vacuum. It is my belief that the color balance, the contrast mapping, meaning the blacks and the whites, are all going to be subdued considerably when staring through water, even if you could purify the living shit out of it in some device. The other one would be trying to rid the entire system of air bubbles, would probably have to require some sort of agitation device, right, where something vibrates the entire set, takes the astronaut's body, vibrates them. Perhaps you have to have a hose, where you got water coming out of a hose inside a water tank, and you'd have to sit there and just knock out every single air bubble everywhere constantly, especially if you're claiming to do live footage, which is probably a bunch of horse shit, right? I don't believe for a second that anything is live from NASA. I mean, right now you can go on YouTube and you can watch a bunch of live videos, and they're all recorded weeks and months and years ago. So you'd think that after it was aired, it would lose its title of being live, right? Streaming is one thing. Playing back is a different thing, right? Because of all of those anomalies I just mentioned, one, I will acknowledge the fact that there does seem to be water-based footage. And because they do train in water, it's very conceivable that they did take this technique for certain shots and they use it. There are objects that float around in the water, right? They'll bring bags out with tools in them, and I don't mean to say water 100%, but they'll seem to have zero-G behavior with a lot of tools and bags and all kinds of things, and either it is water or it's a vacuum of space and they're really in zero-G gravity, or they figured out some other technique 100%. Perhaps these elements are actually computer generated and simply composited in. Perhaps because Gravity, the movie, is 99% computer generated. The only thing that is not generated is the hands and the face that are inside the movie. Even Sandra Bullock's body is when she's nude, bouncing, or not nude, but she's in her panties bouncing around the inside of this place. It's all CG. I believe there's a scene between her and George Clooney in a capsule about 2/3 of the way through the movie where they actually are live action actors and it's their bodies and they're in a set. But outside of that, before the very final scenes back on Earth, the entire thing is CG. And it's made out of some weird, mysterious company in like Germany or something. So you take all of that knowledge, jack it up 3 or 4x in its level of clarity and granularity, and now you have inside a computer everything you need to generate a space station. You can composite in the faces too. When these astronauts turn the camera around, look at their face behind a spherical mirror. That's what they figured out in Gravity several years ago. And again, if it's in the private sector, that means it's in the public sector. It's been the private sector forever. The other idea, okay, is that this is a set that if we can solve for a lot of the zero-G behavior of objects, which again are pretty sparse, right? Again, the other thing too is if you're in water and you have a wrench that weighs a pound, it ain't going to float in the water, people. It's going to sink. So water doesn't solve all your zero-G problems unless everything's on a tether, which it could be. For those of you that saw 2001: A Space Odyssey, and if you haven't, you should, There's a scene where a guy falls asleep on his ride to this big wheel turning in space, and they have a ballpoint pen that just sits there, and while the classical music's playing, it's floating around in front of him, and this woman comes up and grabs it and puts it in his pocket. And the way that that's done is that they had a big sheet of glass, and they stuck the pen to the glass, and someone just turned the glass to give it this sense of weightlessness. And so, that's one-dimensional, or I guess I should say two-dimensional plane. It's pretty easy to simulate, but a leather canvas bag, wobbling in space takes a lot more effort. But the other one is, how does Earth show up in the shot, whether or not it's water or not? I can definitely tell you that they can create a composite grid of LED screens at what we call a high pitch, which means a high resolution, and especially filmed from 20 feet away. Your brain will sew them all together, even on a 6mm LED. And so you just have the gigantic warehouse, inconceivably large warehouse. The big warehouses that host the space shuttle and a lot of the rockets down in NASA, Florida, was the JFK Center. The building is so big it has its own ecosystem, and it has its own weather system. And I'm sorry, like it will rain inside the building because it's so big. Probably not torrential rain, but more like Hawaii drippity drop rain. But again, this is where we get into this anomaly of we can smell the bullshit. We can totally sense the bullshit with the ISS, but we can't understand exactly how they've done everything, and we don't have to know how everything is pulled off as a hoax to understand something's wrong. We also have a couple of the things that are going on up there that I think are unacceptable, even if it were real. One, astronauts running around in gorilla outfits, which happened. We paid to ship a gorilla outfit supposedly to the ISS. I think someone did the math on it because they've sent up things of certain weight. The gorilla costume would have cost about $20,000 to send up there. Another one is, guys bring guitars and play songs up there. And again, you have to build some social environments so you don't go nuts, but I'd rather see a guitar up there than a gorilla outfit that's going to be used one time to create some silly show. And again, you have a gorilla outfit with synthetic hair that's going to start floating around the vacuum of this place, and it just seems ridiculous. Tiny hair fibers can create shorts and things if you have exposed wires. And again, you might say, well, the surface doesn't have any exposed wires. Yeah, well, fine. You pull out a panel for maintenance, and this brunette with, hair like mine, hair goes straight in there where the guy's turning talking to his buddy, and then he closes the panel up, and later on we get a short. And then everyone could die, right? One of the telltale signs of a hoax is when the two astronauts wore the two jerseys for the 16-17 Super Bowl, right? I forgot the teams because I didn't watch it, but you have them, the chicks wearing one and the dudes wearing the other. Those 38 teams, right? So you'd have to ship up there 38 times 2 jerseys to make sure that one person could wear one at their size and the other one could wear one at their size. Someone did the math, and it's like $500,000 just to ship all that shit up there. And then what are you going to do with all the jerseys that are up there? Wouldn't everyone else be wearing one of these jerseys that it's their favorite team, right? The Steelers don't get in the Super Bowl, but we got 2 Steelers jerseys, and you're bored to death. Wouldn't you wear the other jersey? It's bullshit. They never fucking send that stuff up there. It's a ridiculous thing that they would spend more than 5 student educations on sending like $100,000 will buy a degree for a kid, a 4-year degree. Not at the best school, but at a decent school. And they just piss that away so they could pay homage to the Super Bowl. The thing has turned into a disgusting Hollywood production. All NASA shit is a disgusting Hollywood production. Ever since the Saturn V got lit by Hollywood, they called Hollywood to make the Saturn V look sexy. We don't need sexy from scientists. We need results from scientists. And what are they doing up there anyway? When's the last time you heard anything that they're doing up there that has anything to do with our lives? making polymers and metals and figuring out how life can metabolize in space. That's what it used to be in the 80s. All right, what are you doing? What are you doing with all that fucking money? What are you doing up there in the first place? You're not doing us any favors for deep space travel. You're just up there fucking around in costumes, playing songs, doing David Bowie tributes, wearing fucking jerseys, goofing off, doing videos, telling us what you would be doing if you weren't doing a video, right? Now let's get over to Gravity, the movie, for 1 second. For those of you who haven't seen this movie, it stars Sandra Bullock and George Clooney and a handful of other folks, I think, but they're the two main ones. And it has to do with a piece of space debris, space rock, even I think it's just a space debris, but it starts messing with everything in orbit. You know, again, we have thousands and thousands of objects supposedly in orbit around the Earth, and also the ISS has never seen anything go by in all their footage. Never a satellite go by, ever. And yes, we all understand how big space is, but give me a fucking break. If something stays up there for 10 years, you should be able to see a few communication satellites sweep by. These Google Earth mapping satellites, which just do ribbons around Earth, you know? But the movie's based on the fact that if a tiny rock were to go through the space station, traveling anywhere from 15,000 miles per hour to 35,000 miles per hour, there ain't nothing you can do about it. It'll punch through the one side of the tube, through the astronaut's body, and through the other side of the tube, and at such a speed, at such a rate, that you would never see it. It would just occur. And the astronaut's body would invert. If you've ever seen the footage, it's really amazingly disturbing footage. But there was some footage where, and I don't know if it's real, but it was submitted by the military, but they're shooting people with a 20 millimeter gun, and they were sort of like Taliban-looking guys on a hillside, and you have a guy walking down, and a 20 millimeter round hits this guy's body. The body inverted and turned into like goo instantaneously. And there was a reel out there that must have been about 25 minutes long or something like that, where you could just watch dozens and dozens of these guys walking around, and they're just being turned inside out. It's almost so absolute in their utter vanishing act, right? Their body just vanishes. It just vaporizes. That it wasn't gory. It was almost like a special effect. Now, it could have been. I don't know. It was not pawned off as fake. The ISS, as well as all of the other space stations the Russians had, we've had, they've never, ever once had an anomaly with space debris. Rocks, meteorites, never. And again, just to quote my astronomy teacher back in high school, he said that by 1985, the average bombardment of the entire circumference of the Earth, on a spherical circumference of the Earth, it was 100 million little rocks per minute hitting Earth. Now, again, a lot of that's little tiny dust particles and that kind of stuff. What they did was they measured a square in space, and then they averaged that out over the distance of the entire world's circumference on a spherical plane, and they come up with the number. But the idea that this thing could sit out there forever and ever and ever and never suffer a sling or an arrow of a meteorite is impossible to believe. Quite frankly, for all the satellites that are in space, it's impossible to believe they're up there and capable of functioning forever. We do have, shielding around the Earth. And it's, again, if you read about the sun, what's funny is they'll tell you it's got a plasma core. On Wikipedia and a bunch of other. Just go look at plasma energy, read about it, and then cross-reference that with the sun. But supposedly we don't have the same center for the planet Earth, which is stupid. Just because our surface is cold and it's not on fire doesn't mean we don't have the same mechanics inside. A big rig has a combustion engine, so does a little two-cycle motorcycle, right? Same theory. But shit gets through all the time. We have meteor showers. How do we have a meteor shower where we're all sitting here on Earth watching meteors enter the atmosphere to the point we can record them with, off-the-shelf cameras, but the space station never, ever gets hit by this stuff? Again, this is why I think that NASA JPL is being slowly dismantled, probably going to take 20, 30 years, but they're being slowly dismantled into the private sector because liability goes with that assignment. We didn't launch that stuff. We didn't make those claims. Okay, a little tiny corporation goes down the tube. Start up a brand new one. Well, we're going to make things right. We couldn't believe how those people lied on camera and used, SpaceX using all this CG footage. In fact, what is it? Virgin, whatever the hell they're calling their space agency. There are individuals that have done a pretty good job proving that the Virgin space program is actually repackaging the CG that they use to sell their project to their investors as the actual footage of the event occurring. North Korea has submitted a lot of CG footage of their rockets taking off. And it really is the way that we determine that, just so that you know, is that we have particle systems that are in 3D software. And what does that mean? Well, if you want to simulate, say, smoke or fire, we can create what's called a particle emitter, and it creates 3D particles at such density that it looks real. But the problem is they're using an algorithm to color the smoke, an algorithm to color the fire, to give it its bursty footprints. And obviously, fire towards the ground behaves a little bit different than fire that's up, a quarter mile in the sky because of the vectoring of the fire. The smoke changes. The smoke is typically more billowy and fake and puffy like cotton candy when it's fake, and it's much more intense when it's real. And again, we've got hundreds of hours of rocket footage that's real on planet Earth, so you can just watch one and then watch their shit and go, oh my God. But one of the other big telltale signs they fuck up all the time is something that we used to call it skating. When ILM was trying to figure out how to render dinosaurs for Jurassic Park, there's a situation where the camera is being panned. It's being pulled through a jungle set that's really low lit, right? And you have to put a dinosaur in that. And the dinosaur's coming after the Jeep, with Jeff Goldblum in the back and company. If the dinosaur feet don't connect to the ground, and if the CG artist doesn't take into account how far a dinosaur would move in a particular footstep, right? If they speed it up too much or slow it down too much, the plate that's underneath, it's actually live action, meaning real. And the dinosaur, it doesn't match up. And so they have something called skating because it looks like it's on wheels, right? So with these rockets, especially the ones that North Korea put together, they have composited this stuff in such that if you just keep your eye still, the camera that's filming the rocket is also locked to the ground in a tripod, right? The rocket seemingly will take left-right moves in pixels. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, and as it's going up. Something that it can't do in real life, right? Because that pixel left-right would be 6 or 7 inches in real life, and so the rocket can't just be swaying in space, on the launch pad left and right, 100% from top to bottom. It just doesn't work like that. It takes pressure and force to move something in space. That's how physics works, right? In closing, what I'll say is this. In my Facebook feed, my home feed or whatever, not my personal feed, there is nothing in my personal feed. If you became my friend on Facebook, you would be very bored to death because there's nothing on my page and there never ever will be. But on the home feed, I have, a collection of individuals who are either scientists or they are special effects people. They deal in Hollywood at all kinds of levels. And they take an amazing amount of pride out of everything that NASA claims to do. And they fill up their feed with at least a third to a fourth of this regurgitation of the hoax, right? They will claim, they're like, look at this beautiful footage. Aren't we amazing? And because they're involved with something really neat that's real in real life in Hollywood, it's real fiction, they sort of say, well, geez, look at the heroes that actually do the real stuff. Well, it ain't real. When you see these ridiculous pieces of footage of the Earth with this, they're rotating over at nighttime and you get to see all these city lights. The curvature is insane, right? It'd be like a marble. You wouldn't have enough space to put the continents on it. The atmosphere is like, several hundred miles thick and 100% visible at night. I mean, it's just ridiculous how the geometry doesn't match reality. But what the sad part is, people eat this shit up because they want to feel like they are amazing. And now we come back to the social element, the underpinning of the whole thing. I've said this a couple times, and I'm going to keep repeating it until I hear people repeat it back to me. So let's say they are faking a lot of this stuff, and whatever they're doing is not what they say they're doing. Maybe there's something up there, whatever. Is it inspiring children to get into science? I was hugely inspired by the space program that was happening when I was being born, right? They hit the moon about a month before I was born. Theoretically, right, in the fake science of the world. We'd never went to the moon. Sorry, folks. But I grew up with that, 2001: A Space Odyssey, which inspired me to get into artificial intelligence, inspired me to get into everything rocketry, and just understanding it. And I never really wanted to be an astronaut. And there's a weird thing about that, too. If any of you have ever wanted to be an astronaut, you start doing all of the due diligence that it takes to become one. And you start to learn that just a tiny hair of people ever become astronauts. And some of them are former fighter pilots who flew the space shuttle. But a lot of these astronauts are really weird people, right? I mean, they have hugely strange pasts and all kinds of affairs going on. They seemingly act like idiots when anything in life happens. Maybe that's just the way the nerds handle it. But it seems like they have found, at least for the International Space Station, a bunch of people that need fucking attention. Because that's all they do is engage in attention-getting things. The guy who sat out there for 47 minutes filming nothing but the Earth and the space station had to film his face, for 10 minutes of the 47-minute thing. Just to kind of say, it's me, baby. When I get back, can I get some trim? Because I'm a fucking astronaut, right? But does it do any good at all to claim to kids that we can do these things? Because I can see someone saying, well, you're just pissing on something, some inspiring kids to get into science. I will give you a little bit of my agreement on that. It does inspire kids. The only problem is a couple things. One, it's indoctrinating them straight into the horseshit science that will keep them down their whole lives because they can't study the real stuff. And the worst part about the whole space program, as it has been constructed out of a house of cards where each card has a lie on it, is that kids think we've done all this shit already. Does any kid want to discover Hawaii? Is any kid in Europe trying to discover North America? Nope. Does any kid want to do anything that's been done before? I mean, yeah, there's a bunch of millennials out there trying to fucking bite off everything that's ever been done because they can't think of an original thought on their own. But aside from those exceptions, nobody wants to do anything that someone else has already done. And so if you tell children we've been to the moon, they don't fucking want to go to the moon anymore. But if we've never been there, who's ever going to go? A foreign agency, maybe? If you tell them we've been to Mars, there's a little bit of an interest in going to Mars as a human being. According to Elon Musk, we should already be there by now. But that guy will claim shit left and right and never, ever, ever make it happen. And no one retracts or tallies up how much bullshit this guy spews constantly. I mean, this fucking guy could get on the news tomorrow and say, I'm going to create a time machine by the end of the year. It's going to bounce around and he's going to get all these accolades for making a claim like that. And then it will never happen. No corporation's ever created to look into time travel. And he just gets to go into the next year with the accolade that he created a time machine, right? I mean, or that he's that fucking smart. But he never creates it. Never even tries. But because, I guess, we have no more heroes in the world that are actually smart. We have Bill Nye the douchebag guy and Neil deGrasse Tyson. We have no heroes. We have no integrity. Who knows if Stephen W. Hawking's saying anything that he's claimed to be saying. You realize all you got to do is program his box to say whatever the fuck you need that guy to say. Push him out in front of an audience, You know, you could be like, I like to cross-dress and I like touching boys. And he couldn't get out of the chair and say, that isn't me. He couldn't make a fucking eye gesture to say that isn't what he's saying. But we're swallowing it like we don't have a fucking brain. It's gross. It is gross. It is weird. And I think that in terms of space programs, someone has to have the balls to push stop and pause before you push start. You know, you might want to say we need a reset button, but I think that there isn't enough time between a reset button. What's a reset button? It does a shutdown and a restart, right? We need some big time between starting up a $60 million a day organization again. Hey, if these NASA guys are so goddamn smart, they'll have no problem getting jobs in the private sector. Right? They're fucking geniuses. They know how to do all kinds of wild shit. So fine. All of you good with aerodynamics, you go work for the aeronautical industry making the best fucking 797 out there. You go and make a Formula One car that can go 900 miles an hour. If you're that much of a fucking genius, then you have nothing to worry about. And everyone I've ever met from NASA is pretty goddamn smart, if not just certifiably genius. Now, at the same time, we have to make sure that we don't demonize everyone who works. At the same time, we have to be careful, you know, creating a witch hunt for everyone who works for these organizations, because again, these individuals have been duped. They're compartmentalized. There are plenty of interns out of Caltech that are working at JPL, and they're in the same town, Pasadena, and they really believe what they're doing is happening because they're being duped. Now, as soon as you start showing that sort of Eddie Haskell gene, where you're an ornery fuck, but you're also really smart, you can get invited to a deeper layer of the maze, as Westworld would say. I can't forget the time that the two guys who did some special effects in Hollywood back in the early 80s. I was talking to them in the suite in San Diego, and I said, where you been? And they said, we worked for JPL for about 13 years creating, you know, photoreal terrain software. And they started telling me about it, and they said, yeah, and we worked together there, and with this guy right here, and this guy they're pointing at was behind me, this bizarre kind of albino-looking guy in a black outfit with all this crazy, you know, Masonic fucking rings on his hands, plus like coke-sniffing pinky rings and shit. And he was pacing back and forth with one ear into our conversation, kept looking at me, and every time I look at him, he'd look away. And it was just the most eerie fucking thing ever. And this guy still worked for GPO, which is, Christ, 20 years past when these guys quit. That's the kind of guy. That's the kind of guy that's got nothing. Watching the world burn? Well, why not? And all it takes is a handful of those dudes to create any type of hoax you can imagine. So if you haven't heard the argument that the International Space Station has a bunch of shenanigans attached to it, well, now you know. Go look it up for yourself, and you are going to find tons of videos where people are off on these tangents that don't really pan out, and you might roll your eyes and go, well, these are a bunch of bozos. Just understand that that's probably disinformation or just a poor kid trying to do his best, trying to make sense out of something, and because he may or may not have any science background, he can't mix things together, you know. I guess the one thing I forgot to mention is this idea that the space station is at an atmospheric level where the atmosphere is supposed to be several thousand degrees in heat, and it's supposed to melt while it's up there. The excuse you hear from NASA is that the particles are so far apart that they can't gang up and create that sustained heat up there, and so that's how the space station is able to exist. But Brian Mullen brought up a good point that the third rule of thermodynamics is that when you have a cold object in space, especially as big as a football field up there, these particles that are at that agitated level of 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that, it's really hot up there, that they will naturally attract to the cold because hot attracts to cold. When it's hot outside and you're air conditioning your house and you open the door, the heat is trying to push into your house. When you have it heated up inside and it's cold outside, the heat tries to get out of your house. That's just the way it works. And why is that? Because one has agitation and one is not moving at all. So the only one that can actually travel is the one that has the force inside of it, the frequency, to actually make a change in itself, right? A state change from point A to point B. Very basic stuff. I hope you feel me. DeepThoughtsRadio.com for all the feeds. Everything's on that domain now. So the video I've split up. Vid.me has season 1 on the website now. Everything's on YouTube, but again, YouTube, I don't know what their problem is with copyright, as I always say, but if you want to watch season 1 in its pristine quality and hear it in its pristine quality, either go for the podcast, which doesn't have any problems, or go for the vid.me Deep Thoughts Radio channel to see it, if you want to see it. I think YouTube will be safe the way I'm cutting the rest of it together. I am mirroring everything to vid.me if you just want to go to one location and live there. It is on iTunes. Just again, Deep Thoughts Radio. Just look for the black and white sunglass shot. I've also recently pushed it out to Google Play and put a link on the deepthoughtsradio.com feed in case you're coming through Android. There's a direct feed to the RSS podcast up there as well, but you want to access that from your telephone. So it immediately goes to your particular player. Other than that, take care of yourself and someone else, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.